On today's Newsmakers, is Christianity in Syria doomed to be destroyed? That is what we are talking about with Joel Veldkamp. He is the head of communications at Christian Solidarity International, and he joins us to break down the issues that are going on in Syria, why his organization supports pulling back on sanctions, and much, much more. With no further ado, here is Joel Veldkamp. Joel, appreciate you coming on today. A lot of news coming out of the Middle East right now, particularly when it comes to America and our role on the global stage. Now, President Donald Trump, he has essentially pledged to end sanctions against Syria. Before we get into all of the issues around that, what are those sanctions? What has the impact of them been?
Yeah, the impact of the sanctions has been really devastating, Billy. The U.S. and its allies imposed these sanctions on Syria in 2011, just as the civil war between the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad and the rebel coalition led by al-Qaeda-linked jihadists was beginning. And supposedly the goal of the sanctions was to either punish the Syrian government for its crimes against the Syrian people or pressure them into a diplomatic solution. But the effect was really to devastate the country. I actually lived in Syria for a year before the war started, and it was not a rich country, but it was a middle-income country. It was a country with a middle class. Today, over 90% of Syrians live in poverty. Over 500,000 Syrian kids are shorter than they should be because malnutrition has got so bad in Syria. And a lot of that is directly attributable to the sanctions.
And the goal of the sanctions obviously seemed to be to knock the regime out, get new power in Syria. Would you say that that's an accurate assessment of why this went on for so long?
It seems to have been. The civil war in Syria was really a proxy war between the US and Russia. And for a long time, it seemed like Russia had won because they supported the Syrian government, and the Syrian government really seemed to have won the day. But of course, the Syrian government collapsed in December. And as President Trump said in Riyadh yesterday when he made this announcement, the sanctions seemed to have served their function. So if we take the president's word seriously, the function of the sanctions was to bring about regime change in Syria to the US's liking.
Now, Christian Solidarity International, you guys have long advocated for pulling back on these sanctions, but right now you're also warning, and feel free to fill in any of the blanks here, that there need to be some protections that are baked into any sort of rescindment of these sanctions because of the situation on the ground there. Can you explain?
Sure. Well, we're against these broad economic sanctions that target the whole country, that hurt all Syrians, regardless of who they are. And we want those to be removed no matter what. So we're really glad that Trump is taking this step. We've always heard from Christians in Syria that this is an essential step if Christians themselves are going to survive in Syria as a religious group. But the problem is this regime change that the sanctions seem to have been a part of bringing about replaced a brutal dictatorship in Syria with an al-Qaeda-linked dictatorship. The current ruler of Syria, the president of Syria, is the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria. He used to be called Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Now he goes by the name Ahmed al-Shara. And the US seems to think that they can work with him. But in the last few months, we've seen huge massacres of religious minorities in Syria. We've seen thousands of Alawite Muslims killed on the Syrian coast by pro-government forces. We've seen attacks now on a different community called the Druze, and a lot of the Christians are wondering if they're next. So even as these sanctions get taken away, the US needs to be really focusing on this and really thinking what else they can do to make sure that Christianity is not destroyed in Syria.
You know, as you saw images of President Donald Trump shaking hands with Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara, what went through your mind? I mean, that must have been kind of wild to see.
It's a completely mind-blowing. For most of the past 14 years, the U.S. has had a $10 million bounty on Ahmed al-Shara's head because, as I said, he was the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria. So to see him shaking hands with the American president is just wild. It's not to say that we don't want peace with Syria. We don't want Syria to prosper. Of course we do. So do Christians in Syria. And those are the people that we're advocating for. But President Trump said something very interesting when he made this announcement. He said, he encouraged Syria. He said, good luck, Syria. Show us something special. do something like Saudi Arabia has done. And that was a very telling moment because Saudi Arabia is a very rich country. It's also a country where every person is required by law to practice only a very extreme kind of Islam. There's no religious freedom in Saudi Arabia whatsoever. In Syria, Christians live there, Druses live there, Alawites live there, and Muslims live there, and mostly in peace, not always without problems. But Syria has been this way for centuries. But right now, Syria is on the way to becoming like Saudi Arabia. We're in danger of losing this diversity. Just the fact that Christians have been in Syria for the past 2,000 years. We might be on the verge of losing that if the Trump administration doesn't pay attention.
So you're essentially saying, and perhaps he was talking, Trump, about the finances of it, not the religious liberty of it, right? These are two very different things. And so if you have a wealthy country, and you say, okay, work towards that. But your warning here is that, well, wait a minute, they actually have some religious liberty and freedom despite what's coming potentially. And that could actually be in danger if they followed the full advice and went after the way that Saudi Arabia has structured their own country.
Absolutely. And Saudi Arabia is one of the main backers of the new Syrian government. So if they don't hear some counter voice from the US, then they are going to go in that direction and very quickly. So because Ahmad Ashara is a recognized member of al-Qaeda, there are sanctions just on him as a person and on some of his lieutenants. And what our recommendation at CSI is, remove the sanctions that hurt all Syrians, remove the sanctions that affect the whole country, but these individual sanctions on Ahmed Ashara, on his men, ask for something before you remove those. Ask for accountability for the massacres of Alawites and Druses that have happened in Syria. Ask for firm guarantees for religious freedom for Christians in Syria.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, too, because part of the complexity here is you've mentioned some of the attacks on other groups. Christians, we know that Christian persecution around the globe is raging worse than it ever has in history. And you have a situation here where you have this, al-Qaeda head who's now in charge of Syria, essentially, who has said on the record that they're going to respect religious liberty. They're going to respect Christianity. So you have all of these conflicting messages, and actions speak much louder than words. So talk a little bit more about the specific fears for Christians in light. And I know we talked a little bit about this, but I think it's important to really drive this home. If nothing happens here, if there's no accountability, and you have a country that descends into extremism from the top down, what could happen to the Christians there?
Yeah, one possibility is that Syria becomes a place like Iran, for example, where women are not allowed to have their hair uncovered in public, where you can't buy or sell alcohol, where you can't have any manifestation of Christian religion in public, and where, under Sharia law, for example, Christians can't testify against Muslims in court, or Christians have to pay more taxes than Muslims. This is how it historically was in Syria under the Ottoman Empire and under the other Islamic empires. But Christians in Syria today are not going to accept this kind of second-class status where they're constantly at risk of being attacked if they show their Christian identity. So if that happens, I think all the Christians of Syria will leave. There is also the potential for mass violence against Christians. That happened during the Syrian civil war. Ahmed Ashara, the new president, his group attacked Christian villages and Christian towns and massacred Christian civilians. And there's no guarantee that won't happen again, especially when we see the violence that's happening against Alawites and Druses.
So there is a history there, and there's a recent history of other groups having these experiences. Now, are some of those skirmishes a result of frustration and anger over the regime change? Is it a mixture? Are they targeted towards those groups due to theological perspective from what we know? And I know that's a complicated question because we don't have all of the intent and we don't know it all.
Yeah, my answer to questions like this is usually yes, right? There is a state building imperative where the new Syrian government wants to consolidate its control, and a convenient way to do that is to rile people up to attack a hated group. Right? So the official ideology of the groups that have seized power in Syria is that Alawites and Druses are infidels, they're kuffar, they can and should be killed or enslaved. And the new Syrian government is showing that it can use those sentiments when it needs them, right? When it feels like its control in some of these regions is slipping. So the massacres in the Syrian coast in March, for example, seem to have been triggered either by an attack by some Alawite insurgents on government forces or scuffles between Alawite protesters and police. We're not exactly sure still, but the reaction was a massacre of thousands of people, troops going village to village, asking people, what is your religion? And if they answered the wrong way, they were shot. So the potential for extreme violence is still very much there.
Yeah, and I think we can close out with this, because this is sort of a foreign concept for Americans and people in the West, that the president of Syria, just to drive this home, President Ahmed al-Shara is a terrorist, essentially, and has been a terrorist, right? So whether or not he changes course at this point, this is a man who has traditionally, for over a decade, been a terrorist, anti-America, going after anybody who is not a Muslim, essentially, correct?
Correct. He got his start fighting against American troops in Iraq. That's how his career began.
So we have to be praying about that, praying for Syria, praying for wisdom, praying for the Christians there. And how can people find more information about this, keep up with what CSI is doing in that region?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd invite your followers to go to our website, www.csi-usa.org. You can learn more about the different pieces of information that we're publishing about Syria, and also about some of the things we're doing to help Syrian Christians in concrete ways.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time and joining us, as always, to break down this important story. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Billy.
That's all for today's Newsmakers. Make sure you head on over to the CBN News YouTube channel and cbnnews.com for more of the news you need to read. We'll see you again tomorrow.